Hello and welcome to the first of our sessions in our theory workshop, really. I'm delighted to be joined here by Sanford, Marina Victoria, and our two guests today, Barry and Barbara. Just to say a few words by way of introduction, in some ways, Sanford certainly doesn't really need any introduction at all. Sanford has got a reputation that precedes him. He is his background is in comparative literature, and he's been teaching at many of the top schools in the States. Rice, followed by MIT, followed by Harvard, followed by Pratt. I can't really keep track of that. Importantly, also, Sanford has been involved in zone publishing and has been instrumental in I think one of the most vibrant and interesting publishing houses around, and was helpful in helping to launch Sanford Manuel de Landa's career. And importantly, also, Sanford was part of our discussion last year. We had an amazing theory workshop as part of Digital Futures World that led to lots of different things. His capacity to delight and to come up with informed commentary and decisions and so on is really the basis of this. We're centering everything around Sanford as the kind of a figure whom I certainly admire enormously, and who has a very provocative and interesting way of looking at the world. Also joining us as part of the core background team are two members from last year's event, Victoria Luisa Barbu and Marina Rodriguez das Neves. Up and coming theorists. I don't know if they would want to call themselves theorists, but people I think that the future is in good hands when Victoria and Marina are around. Victoria is from Germany. She's a graduate from Pratt. She's currently working in practice, but I predict she has a very a very significant future ahead of her as somebody, as a kind of a provocateur, a thinker, if not necessarily an academic theorist as such, but I hope she will be. Marina is from Argentina, from La Plata in Argentina. She was also part of the discussion last year, and was instrumental in fact, both Victoria and Marina were instrumental in setting up the Digital Futures platform as a continual year-round platform where we had discussions every single week. Marina is, I'm delighted to have her as a colleague, and also as a member of our DDES community, a Doctor of Design community at Florida International University. Marina spans a lot of different backgrounds. She is both practicing architect and theorist and historian, and increasingly kind of AI expert. So this is the kind of what we're doing is really opening up a platform for this debate and discussion. It's completely informal. It's completely unpredictable, and I don't know where it's going to lead to. But I think this is one of the delights of this particular platform, is we can allow things to unravel and roll as they wish. There is no set format for any of these things. Each day we are inviting in guests in a way to spark off a conversation of some kind. And we'll just see where we go. We have approximately 2 hours in which to complete what we're going to complete. And at this point, I will simply hand over to Sanford and to introduce our two key guests today. Sanford, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Look, in deference to and in honor of the mandate to maintain a certain level of spontaneity and informality, I have decided to simply respond as a theorist, and in some ways here as a co-host, or let's say a second level host, to what comes up. And I also do believe that in a forum like this, in my experience of it now in the second year, is that it has been phenomenally rich in a way, strangely, because of our isolation and because of the pent up, shall we say, pressure inside of all of us, social, but is also social and intellectual. There has been, in fact, a far richer component of an unanticipated emergence of questions thoughts and ideas in these Zoom sessions that Neil's been organizing. It is the only reason I submit myself to the incredible stress of doing so many of these. I don't know how he does it, honestly, but I have to say it was for me a game changer. Last year, I was reluctant to do it, and when it started to happen, I couldn't believe what was happening. I couldn't believe it happening on a number of levels. But I do want to say that there is a spontaneous and creative component to this kind of physically remote and culturally diverse participation, which I've never seen matched in the much richer, in certain ways, actual in-person type conferences. And I think it's something that I am really interested to seek to continue to tap. I wanted to say that because it excuses everything, and I hope it opens everything in everyone's mind. I will also like to say a couple of things because it came to mind listening to just a few words that Neil presented. One was the invocation of the title, which is sometimes active, sometimes not, of digital futures. And I wanted to say a couple of things about that because there is, one could say, maybe a tendentiousness that one could read in that title, as if the combining of those two terms was making a statement that the future would be digital, or that there was something to celebrate in that idea or something to challenge. Now, I would say it's obviously all of those things, but sometimes it needs to be said that that copula, whatever it is that puts digital and future together, even though I know that Neil has already started breaking down the digital and sometimes replacing it with another term. I think that tells us that futures is the real problem, and that any appended word is an experiment, is, let's just say, a hypothesis. So I would like to say that as a way of setting up the conversation that we're going to have today. Experimental has suddenly become possible. I would say it because of the format that we are in. I know that Neil, I know that he knows that, and I know that he participates in that, but no one says it. So I wanted to say it. The next thing I wanted to say was, in the last few weeks, I've noticed that a lot of younger people have felt very uncomfortable with the application of the term theory or theorist when it was thrown onto them. You heard that in Neil's presentation. Obviously, there was a bit, there's always going, it's understandable, a bit of squirming on a number of, but especially on Victoria Marina's parts, et cetera. Neil sort of acknowledged that that would be the case. It was certainly the case in a number of other people with whom we've engaged in the last few weeks. And I have to say that label is a complicated one today, clearly more so among the emerging generation. Nobody really wants to say they want to wear that suit just yet. There seems to be a lot of reasons why it seems a little too austere, perhaps, or a little too weighty, or whatever. I think it's a thing to keep in mind, okay? And somebody said to me recently, I'm not going to say any names, somebody who was recently, shall we say, publicly acknowledged for their capacity to produce useful theoretical direction in a particular area of design. And she says, I don't dare do this. I'm scared. I can't take this on completely, this label, because it's the kind of thing that you do. Or what she mean by that is our generation do. And I remember by way of whatever it is, constellation, and I said to this person, "Oh no, that's the old theory," which of course I felt was making room for what is necessarily going to have to be the new theory. And I would like to say that in some ways, the new theory is a theory that is done, let's say, not entirely within the ghetto of discursive practice, but which engages, if we like, a multiplicity of practices by maintaining at the same time the necessary rigor and discipline, but not necessarily a purely discursive one. And that is partly an introduction to the two practitioner, thinker, theorists, thought leaders, because it's a more general term, that we're going to be listening to today. And the next thing I want to say is that my task, increasingly, to the degree that I recognize the need for a transformative, new, shall we say, approach to what needs to be preserved, if you like, from the uses of thought, which, let's just say, were unnecessarily ghettoized for the longest time within a purely discursive, historical, philosophical practice as theory. My goal very, very often in the architecture world, and some people always still shake their head and wonder, what the hell is he going on about, and why should we take notice of it, is I am extremely interested in heterodoxical practices, because I think that these are the only real source of regenerative design thinking. That's to bring in all the things that really do lie just a little bit at the liminal places of where design imagination has often stopped, sometimes crossing over the barrier. And it is where all real creative, free and spontaneous invention and insemination and even miscegenation, if you're still allowed to use that word, take place. That is a bit the topic of what our two speakers are going to go on about today. As we know, we're talking about membranes, but membranes are configured as places that demarcate zones, that demarcate transitions between zones, and also exchanges. I don't know how they're going to construe this, but I know that they are going to place it at the creative center as almost an engine, shall we say, which creates an entirely new space-time, shall we say, for, let's just say that a kind of a space-time which can challenge a heterodoxic concept, which can challenge the very, very remaining classical understandings of tectonics and classical space-time that still, shall we say, limit, I would say, and still constitute how designers, especially architectural designers, think. So there we go. The heterodox is very important. And finally, I wanted to say that I think this section is still being called, quote, really? End quote. I wanted to explain that because it came up simply in a freewheeling, slightly joking conversation with the whole gang, with Marina, Neil, Victoria. In case it's not read properly, it should be exactly the way I just said it. Really, which is fraught with a kind of critical irony, which suggests that whatever was just said could be challenged as being absolutely without foundation are so riddled with bias that it is almost dismissible. And I just want to say, it doesn't apply to our visitors. It applies to some boogeyman which is haunting our thought today. And I think what I understood by this, and is certainly desired by this, was to remind us that these pieties, all of our pieties, need to be challenged, and many really are more than ready for the garbage can. Really? All right, guys, let's go. I'm going to introduce my longtime pal, Brian Boigon, who will start. We go back a long time. I think what we're going to do today is let Brian do his thing, and then we will provide materials and contact information and so on and so forth for follow-up, because I believe that this is a kind of an introduction of a heterodoxic practice, not widely known, but which we hope to bring into the forum of very serious and urgent contemporary questions. So Brian, with that, please take it away.
Thank you, Sanford and Neil and Victoria and Marina. And thank you very much also for Barbara Imhof joining me. I'm going to start by framing the concept of a membrane and read you a comic strip of my writing to frame that properly. And then it's going to lift over for conversation to Barbara, and then we'll open it up. So here goes. The topic today is the magic of membranes. It's an investigation into motion pathways which shuttle between the geometry of science fiction and non-ordinary architecture in outer space. To best frame the concept of a movable membrane, you have to understand membranes are movable, in our respective sites is to do so by accepting the first principle of the membrane as a barrier. The symmetrical quality and mathematical ratio in the design of ricocheting thought through this barrier in a particular architecture comes from locomotion. Simply put, movement is the key to all locomotive design in non-ordinary reality. As such, it braids its all too human barrier of beingness along the unraveling serpentine motion pathways that activate life's morphogenetic entanglements in the fast lane of inner and outer space. Attachment figures aside, love is the ruler that does not need to be measured in any which way or form. More specifically then, there is the programming of a non-ordinary reality cartoon loop that can break the barrier of a specific membrane. Now on to the membrane in fourfoldedness. I'm going to go through fourfoldedness operations of the membrane. The first, number one, a membrane is a barrier that seals off the outer verse like a space station does, like Barbara Imhof is involved in. And number two, we're going to get back to Barbara in a minute. A membrane is a quasi-permeable, bioadaptable seal that, while acting as a barrier, can be used to let some of the molecular guests into the collider club while keeping the left out orphan molecules still entangled and always happy. This is, I'm referring specifically to an early essay in theory by Kwinter called Soft Systems. Three, a membrane can conduct a bifurcation and sustain two or more non-ordinary realities at once. That's Ralph Abraham in The Geometry of Behavior that performs along a tunnel into the underworld of saddle node bifurcation, which I'll talk about later. And fourth and last is a membrane is interoperable. That's my interopera that can interchange matter with waves from another matter and alter its dimension, bomb, wholeness, and implicate order, and Randall and warp passages. So those are the fourfoldedness conditions of the membrane. And I want to turn this back over to Barbara to talk about the barrier in her case.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you also, Neil, Sanford, and Victoria and Marina for the invitation and for me being here. My first point would be 5 millimeters. I like to talk about 5 millimeters. So how much is 5 millimeters? Just imagine, it's probably the half of your thumb, maybe 5 millimeters. So just imagine these 5 millimeters. That is exactly the thickness which separates the astronauts on the space station from the external environment, the deadly environment, the vacuum environment. So this is the membrane, this is the barrier. And what is inside of that? So we have an inside, and the inside is basically, it's a simple geometric form. It's a cylinder. It has a length, let's say, of 12 meters, a width of 4.5 meters. And this barrier, these 5 millimeters, it's exactly, I calculated 0.01 per mil of the diameter. So it's very, very thin. And inside we have 20 degrees Celsius, we have nearly 1 bar of atmosphere, and we have a suitable environment. So what is a suitable environment for a human being? It's probably around 20 degrees. It's oxygen. It's we also need certain humidity. We need water. We need food. We need all this. So inside this shell, which is completely airtight, it has to hold the pressure. We have this suitable environment for human life. And outside, we have the vacuum. We have temperature differences which range between minus 250 degrees Celsius and plus 150 degrees Celsius. We have no pressure, no atmosphere. And if I would go out as I am like now into a vacuum, probably within 10 seconds, I would sort of implode or explode. All my blood would expand and my skin wouldn't be able to hold the sort of the pressure. That's why I need a spacesuit. So these 5 millimeters, that is actually what currently on a space station, the astronauts separates from the exterior environment. And this is because we were also talking about these ordinary places or spaces. And this would be a sort of ordinary constraint. It would be an ordinary geometry. It would be everything ordinary. And so we have these 5, or these volume and these 5 millimeters. And when we go, let's say, onto the moon, then suddenly we have a similar environment. We have a vacuum environment. We have partial gravity. But suddenly we have to sort of also protect ourselves from radiation and from micrometeoroids. And suddenly we have this, we have to use, so membranes, I'll go back one step. So membrane, when you look at, or when you think of membrane architecture, it's something light. It's something, you always think about lightness. And that's the same thing with space modules. They have to be extremely light. They have to, you really have to think about every single gram. So it's $30,000 per kilogram or so upload. And but when you then go for settlements on the moon, on longer missions, then you suddenly need you have to sort of create the non-ordinary, or you have to swap again the way you think and you approach it. You have to go back to something we have been living in, humans have been living in millions of years ago here on Earth. You're creating sort of from local in situ materials, you need to create very thick shells which protect you. And suddenly all this lightness, in a way, is gone. So, so there's a complete contrast in one world, more or less, but different environments. There's the orbital environment, I would say, and then there's the surface environment. And then leading to the permeable, because I like this comparison or the semi-permeable, moving adaptive membrane of a really big spaceship, our Earth, that is looking at the atmosphere. The atmosphere is a membrane. It is permeable. It's gaseous. It's not physical. It's not like the 5 millimeters. But it's also very, very thin in comparison to the Earth's diameter. It is, I think the percentage is a little bit better than the 5 millimeters, but it's 0.8% of the Earth's diameter. So it's a little bit thicker than the 5 millimeters, but it's also an extremely thin, permeable environment. We know that it's permeable because we can't see the boundary, but we also feel it further up than 7,500 meters, 7.5 kilometers, the death zone starts. So humans are not able to live in higher altitudes. And we often think as the Earth atmosphere, ending at the Kármán line at 100 kilometers, which is basically where space starts, although it's a sort of very slow transitioning. And in 1960, Joe Kittinger was the first human to jump from the edge of space. He was going with his gondola, Excelsior 3, up to 32 kilometers. And he jumped from the edge of space. And the interesting thing is that while he was sort of, racing towards Earth, his perception, he was sort of like a cat, turning upside down and looking upwards. He had no sensation of falling. He was in complete equilibrium. So I think I'll leave you with that, this kind of equilibrium from when you jump through this membrane towards Earth, through this very permeable, thin membrane. You have no sensation of falling. You just feel you're sort of floating. But at the right time, you really have to, pull the handle so your parachute opens.
Barbara.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. And I have a quick question just to clarify something that you referred to in the second fold of the membrane, the quasi-permeable one that's related to a seal. I think in terms of what we spoke about earlier yesterday, and I wanted to bring up again, that you mentioned that there's a barrier, a partition between life and death in the semi-permeable nature of the membrane in your environment. And what does that do vis-a-vis you as a designer in the world of space? What is that? How does that impact your process?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think, let's look at the geometry. I think what we have to understand is that sort of on ground, on terrestrial grounds, we are exposed, we have the suitable environment, more or less. We have the one bar, we have the right pressure, and we have sort of temperatures which we like. If not, then we are creating architecture, or we're using architecture to sort of create this, to design an interface between the environment and us. But in space, there is no such thing. We have to create biospheres. We have to create pressure vessels. And so we start mostly with very simple geometric forms. I was mentioning the cylinder because you need something which is sort of pressure, which holds the pressure. So the ideal pressure vessel is a sphere. But from a manufacturing point of view, everybody remembers Sputnik, although Sputnik didn't have to be a sphere at all because no humans lived in there. So the ideal pressure vessel is a sphere, but then you also have the rocket, and I think it's a lot about economics of volume. It's about lightweight. It's about manufacturing. How do you manufacture a piece, let's say a module of that size, 12 meters in length, let's say, which is completely sealed off. And it's mostly also milled from pieces of special metal alloys to sort of minimize the seals one has to produce. And I think that is the special thing, that the geometries one starts with are very simple. That's for the pressure vessel. But then when you change the material and you go for, let's say, membranes, more like, you imagine membranes, something soft, something lightweight, inflatable modules, then you can slightly, you have more variety of creating geometries for habitable spaces. And then when you start using in situ materials, then often with the manufacturing technologies, because it's sort of very archaic and at the same time high tech. You use materials, let's stay at on the moon, materials, regolith material from the moon, and you, for example, laser sinter it, or you contour craft it, solar sinter it, and you create these like thick sort of cave type structures, which underneath you have the pressure vessel, which is then probably a lighter membrane, which is hidden in that kind of very archaic cave structure. So it's a little bit going back to sort of, the origins of human life on Earth in these protected environments, but it's always combined with advanced technologic solutions.
Yes, I just wanted to identify the difference between that kind of dualism that you are continually confronting between, inside and outside, life and death, and all the rest of it. I don't want to diminish what you're saying, but in my case, the area of science fiction, because it can fictionalize reality to explain reality, is involved in my particular case, non-ordinary reality. It becomes a reality. That is to say that ordinary reality inside a space station, for example, I can imagine. I'm sorry, I'm not as well equipped to do that as you are, but I imagine that would be an ordinary reality with ordinances, conventional survival, and and oxidation and all the rest. And in my case, non-ordinary reality presents itself as the ordinary reality. That is to say that I've stopped buying into and investing in the kind of Cartesian geometry of ordinary reality as being the only reality. And I know this is something that's out there and it's contentious around most people, but in terms of consciousness and science fiction, non-ordinary reality becomes multiple realities. And in that case, when you're developing spaceship concepts of geometry or behaviors, you deal more with movement, and therefore the membrane becomes critical. The membrane or locomotion between surfaces, between what you called super light surfaces and the 5 millimeter surface or the membrane, and the movement between things becomes so essentially pivotal. And I think it's very important to raise that today in architecture in particular, because movement, I think, has taken a wayside. It's been pushed over to a lane that hasn't produced enough form for a long time, in my opinion. That software is, sure, animated. There's a kind of formulation to the way in which you move through and script dialogues and make voids and solids, et cetera, and animations. But movement itself, the dynamics of movement itself, that's something critical in your work. The membrane between, the dynamics between two environments that are so extreme.
Yes.
Let me intervene for one quick second. I just want to understand. So are you guys going to be handing off back and forth through the presentation? Is that how it's working? Did you guys plan that? Brian over to Barbara, Barbara over to Brian. Brian, is that how you are planning your presentation?
Well, we've started it, but we don't anticipate, or at least I don't anticipate, anchoring the tenets of the conversation between us without other people. So,
Well, do you have three more? Components to present?
We're touching on the second one, quasi-permeable seals, and the other two I'm going to raise, but we don't necessarily, to your point earlier, in terms of performativity around ideas and thinking and animation of that such and forward thinking, we can move it over to discuss things on a more animated basis between people here in the audience, or between Marina and Victoria, Barbara, Neil, you, etc. So I was seeing the framing of the membrane in these four folded sections, one being a seal, one being a bifurcation, one being a barrier, and one being interoperable. Not the key to the conversation for this session, but a liftoff point.
I mean, I just, Sanford, I think that's a good point. I mean, we in a way, there's been a provocation, and we can almost take it away from there.
That's true. So shall we? I mean, let's ask Barbara and Brian if you have anything else you'd like to ensure gets mentioned, because it's going to go wild now. It's going to go to places unanticipated, and you may never get back home. You guys both are lost in space, and you're about to get more lost. So is there anything you want to say before we begin to, as they say, Houston, we have a problem? Are you ready?
I think just maybe something about how to move, because since we are in this non-ordinary reality, or we are in space, I just want to bring up the matter of orbital mechanics, because it's interesting, because also in the way we think, sometimes we always think in straight lines, maybe not, but in definitely when we try to go from one point to the other on ground, on a horizontal plane, we always look at straight lines. But when you go into space, then suddenly you're sort of within this system of gravitational bodies, and they require completely different movement. And so what you have to do is you have to consider that you suddenly become part of this movement of attractors and of different points, and you have to you can't take a straight line. It's not optimal to take a straight line to the moon and then straight line to Mars. You would use the gravitation of the Earth to sort of speed up, then go into the direction to the moon, and then break again in the lunar orbit, and then sort of go onto the moon. And you would make the same thing going onto Mars. You could even, there are different sort of ways of doing that. So you're always going in these kind of circles, and never a straight line. And I think that is maybe something, because Brian was talking about movements, something which we could also use in our conversation. There's one point, I think, sorry, Sanford, one point, I think Buzz Aldrin suggested going to Mars via a Venus swing by, and I think I just like that, sort of.
Well, explain that. No, explain the swing by, because I happen to know that that's interesting in Brian's work as well.
Well, it's basically what I said before. It's using the gravitational force of another planetary body, not landing, but just using the gravitational force to sort of save fuel and get speed, or get being able to accelerate it, go a little bit further, but not being completely caught in that gravitational force of Venus, not landing.
Yeah, so to your point, Barbara, I use the analogy to ricochet it back to my work in particular, because I know that Sanford's familiar with what I use, this snooker analogy, in billiards, which is a bank point or a bank shot, to use the caveat of a bank or a ricochet surface to swing, as you call it, swing over to something else. Both those things have to do with what I principally think would be a motion pathway. And motion pathways for me, I mentioned to Barbara earlier, and Sanford knows this, I've been interested in cartoon animation for a long time because movement and the geometry of behavior in cartoons is so central to making the expressions, you know, convincing, but nonetheless also entertaining and interactive. And the motion pathway is a key geometry feature of the cartography of how to model spaces of movement in cartoon animation, which I needed to pay attention to in science fiction and the inner opera and in spatial modeling and other forms and other ways to do that. So I just wanted to mention that in a nutshell.
Well, I have 7 or 8 already, 7 or 8 areas of question, and I'm certainly going to invite others. I will deal with one at a time and bring them up only if there is a void. The first one, well, I might have to bring up 2 since I feel that I want to expand the range in everyone else's mind as they come up with questions. So I'm going to mention one, but not ask the question yet. I'm just going to lay it on the table, and then I'm going to go to a much more precise question. The first thing is this, is that in both Brian and Barbara's presentations, and let it be clear and let it be stated and let it be explicit that Barbara is dealing with physics and, shall we say, a certain absolute reality in her work as the framework, whereas Brian is dealing with many of these questions on a more speculative, ultimately you could even say psychic or existential area, and therefore the language will change. But I want to point something out here, is it was already identified that there is amid even the discussion of physics, which will include biology, and the speculative, that the terms and the understanding of domains of engagement and of contact were stated as those of life and death that are both held apart and brought together in the concept of a membrane, which of course, I just want to point out, these have repercussions in 2 completely different ways. The one moving toward abstraction and speculation, but also toward the grounding, if you like, in problems of physics and biology. But I want to add something here, is that Brian mentioned, without elaborating, because there's a third term which brings these together. He mentioned the word love. Now, love is a fascinating term for all kind of reasons, but just to keep it super simple and straightforward, and is that it is also a copula. It is also something that brings together. And it is also something, of course, which articulates difference, because we of a certain age, and I put myself even well beyond most of the others here, we know that in the 1960s and 70s, the most rich speculations on this topic that came from psychoanalysis made us very, very acutely aware that eros and thanatos, love and death, were always bound together. Now, I invoke here people that no one will ever have heard of, like Norman O. Brown, but also many of the radical psychoanalysts of the 1960s. Obviously, it goes deep into Freud, etc. But I do want to say Bataille, and many other places as well. I want to say there's a rich tradition of this. So I want to go back. Life, the membrane, that's to say, the partition that both holds together and separates. The way in which life and death and the dyadic, shall we say, agonism that exists as a kind of an ecological thought, as something that would be a psychic component, if you like, to the way in which we need to change our understanding. And I think, to tell you the honest truth, this is even something that is severely lacking and requires integration even into green thinking and ecological thinking, which I just want you guys to speculate a bit about that.
Okay, so
now, that's not my question, though. That is not the topic I wanted to bring up. The topic I wanted to bring up was gravity. But I tell you what, I went on too long. I'm going to let you guys answer this one, and I'll pick up gravity later if nobody else has anything to say.
Okay, so Sanford, just briefly, I want to qualify the introduction of the word love to people here. So my use of it comes from the interpretation of love in the introductory essay to the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Dalai Lama. And in there, he describes love involving attachment figures. Figures that don't necessarily attach, but love is essentially an attachment figure liminal environment that is attractive and distraction, associated, disassociated, notwithstanding all the dualisms in that. There's something about the way in which love in its ambiguous state looks at the world or expresses itself according to attaching to something, like a designer would attach to an object, like Barbara would attach to machines in outer space necessarily. Like I would attach to a philosophy like Nietzsche, for example, something Nietzsche said or wrote. And those things have to do with affection. Affection has to do with attachment and not possession. That's the big difference. Dalai Lama in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, when he describes it in his introduction, an attachment figure is the ability to attach to something, is to love something, but not permanently, not to possess it, not to own it or disown it, and not to create distance between things. So that, I just to clarify, qualify the entre-nous, the use of the word.
Before you go on, I just want to introduce for our everyone, because these are all topics. This is new, these are ultimately new ways, new models that we would like to bring into the purview of designers, things that have been radically separated from anything that would be considered acceptable in design and ecological thinking. I do want to bring up the term that is probably the single most central term in the Tibetan Buddhist canon, and that is non-attachment. So ultimately, I have to assume that the Dalai Lama was describing a way of qualifying the non-attachment imperative that leads to enlightenment and self-realization. So do you have any speculations on that? Because I guess what we have here is an attachment, non-attachment matrix.
Okay.
How would you guys deal with that?
Well, just one thing, and then I'm going to turn it over. Sorry. It's true. I mean, I agree with you about Dalai Lama presenting that really the non-attachment figurine of the universe for his understanding of Buddhism in particular. But I also think you need to understand that attachment comes with a price in terms of investing in something over a temporal field. And it's in order to do that, you have to also decide, and this is critical on what's been forgotten today a lot in a lot of work. You have to decide how you disassociate from the attachment, and how you do that and not go bankrupt in the process, not diminish your ecology of thinking, but keep the intensity and the vibration at the same level. So anyway, yeah.
Could I just offer a comment at this point? I mean, Sanford, there was a lot of ideas are coming up. I mean, this is actually exactly what I was hoping was going to do. These kind of sessions would produce in many ways. I just want to pick up on the kind of the question of life and death, and to bring the question of attachment. One of the interesting models of looking at that kind of dialectical relationship between life and death was as an example that Zizek gives. And Zizek talks about the difference between a photograph and a movie. The photograph being still and therefore, I guess, dead, and the movie being animated and therefore alive. And what he says is basically Actually, a photograph is simply a frozen moment from within an animated continuum, and a movie is simply a series of those frozen moments stitched together to create this kind of animated continuum, which seems to be a kind of beautiful way of seeing them as completely interconnected in some sort of way. And I was just thinking about an architectural metaphor that was used to describe this by Georg Simmel. I don't know if you know Georg Simmel's work, but I included an essay in Rethinking Architecture where he talks about how the bridge and the door are kind of articulate this. You know, the bridge connects that which is separated, and the door separates that which is connected. And you can't have separation without connection. You can't have connection without separation. Which brings me to this kind of question of attachment and non-attachment. There was one interesting kind of comment. I guess you're all familiar with Lacan's mirror stage essay, where he talks about this moment that we all have supposedly at about 6 months, when suddenly we look in a mirror and we see ourselves as an object in a world of objects. We suddenly realize we're no longer connected to the mother. We are separate. We're on our own, and we've got to look after ourselves. But the point being is that moment of separation is precisely what allows you to connect. You can't connect unless you're separated. So it's kind of like all these domains are kind of are out there in some sort of way. And I just want to kind of throw out here that what I found interesting about the discussion for that Brian and Barbara be talking about is, in some ways, space kind of is also like that mirror in a sense. It's like that mirror in its sense. It forces us to think about who we are and what we're doing. And Barbara will know that one of the first things they did actually when they went to the moon in the first place is they placed a mirror on the moon in order to go and ping back messages to get a sense of how far the moon was away. So what I find very interesting is how this discussion about space forces us, which is a completely other domain, forces us to think about our own domain. But I'll leave it there and hand it over to someone else.
Yeah, I can pick up here because Sanford also, mentioned the aspect of ecology, and I think what I find always interesting with 20 years of work experience in that field of space architecture, space exploration, is that it becomes so, the presence of the fact that one has to create, first of all, life support systems. So systems which support the life of humans. And then you start thinking about, so these would be the building systems, in any kind of building. And then the first thing you start of thinking, how can I recycle the oxygen sort of, or the carbon dioxide, the carbon monoxide, everything which comes from, is sort of part of getting out of the system, or is part of the system but needs to be recycled, sort of. And the water and the urine and everything. And I think that is, and then suddenly these things, so it's sort of turned upside down. So when we work with our partners to design a space station, then our partners are actually the HVAC people, and they sort of lead the design, whereas we as architects, the role is turned upside down. So we as architects are sort of catering to them with design concepts, because it's so it's so vital for surviving to have these life support systems. And then coming back to ecology, so the life support system is actually a biosphere. So in former times, or in the beginning, that was very mechanistic, also chemically driven approach, machinistic approach, and more it's, they are thinking of creating life support systems where biology, microbes play a role, where greenhouses and animals, insects, for example, that Chinese do that quite well, where that plays a role, and that they sort of really create these closed loop system. And that is particularly interesting when we try to look at how we use resources and recycle on Earth, or create self-sufficient systems. And the question here is whether we can sort of integrate these kind of concepts into buildings. You did one project together with Rachel Armstrong, Living Architecture, where we created a bioreactor, which had a couple of membranes, permeable membranes in it, that could sort of clean the gray water, recycle or reclaim resources like phosphate, and sort of become an integral part in an apartment building, and together with greenhouses, which produce biomass for that sort of bioreactor set. And I think that is a sort of, that I find from an ecological perspective and looking at ecologies, I find particularly interesting.
I don't know if we can bring Marina and Victoria in for some comments.
Sanford wanted to say something, but he was
How
muted.
did you know that? I was muted. How did you know? My God.
I saw your
face
moving.
Face change.
Well, okay. So first off, I'd like to say that the type of work, okay, there's an idea that I mentioned recently somewhere in a Zoom, and I reminded myself of, and which I think is a wonderful maxim for approaching all forms of thought. And I'd like to say it really applies to your work, Barbara. And it was by the great early 20th, mid 20th century neurologist Kurt Goldstein, who revolutionized the way in which we study the brain, in which he said that the quote from him is, "There is greater revelation in pathological phenomena," which basically was a way of trying to redirect the field, the scientific method of studying the brain by focusing on the non-ordinary, the non-usual performances that the brain is forced into when it has been, shall we say, damaged, actually. What he means by pathological fall, it means altered from the norm. Now, I believe that what you are doing is a practice which inhabits the state outside of the norm. That's to say, you are basically working through a way of understanding forces which present in pathological form, which is to say, altered from the norm, which is okay. So I think that there is a potential here for greater revelation, shall we say, than we would find in the typical architectural context, where we're always operating within familiar, shall we say, or very routine conditions. Now, you invoked, and I thought it was perfect, the so-called, and the word is continually used, I happen to know this in atmospheric science and in earth science, the membrane, the very thin, they sometimes use the word film that surrounds the earth, which is the zone in which life is able to take place, because there are millions of control mechanisms that maintain an environment within parameters that permit a kind of free profusion, if you like, of the relations required for life. Now, in your work, you are dealing with very gymnastic relationships that all have to be thought through, mastered, included, and engineered. And what we have, in a way, is a simple but brilliant statement, which doesn't really occur in terrestrial architectural thought, but which is critically missing. And I would say that it is this: understanding that life, the strategies that have been evolved by life, include the establishment of membranes, including, of course, the very first membrane that made complex life possible, which was the sac that separated chemical processes from inside and outside the cell, and from the different organelles inside of the cell from one another. That's to say, they made possible systems of relations where you could control the relations, and so on and so forth. But the critical one, of course, is that life has to manage those closed systems, those, shall we say, managed permeable systems, versus the ones that need to remain open. They need to be able to draw not only nutrients, but all forms of advantage from the environment. Now, your whatever it was, the pass-by idea, of course, represents a way of removing, if you like, by exploding the boundary, in that the universe that you need to master is not only pressure, temperature, controlling the gases, and so on and so forth within the atmosphere in order to replicate, if you like, the requirements of human biological life, or whatever, mammalian biological life, but also the gravitational one is critical. As we know, I learned this from one of the great astronauts, one of the great Canadian astronauts, is that one begins to start peeing out one's skeleton within 40 minutes of being in space. And the reason that that begins to happen, and by the way, that process of peeing out your skeleton it doesn't stop. That's why you got to get people out of space within a certain amount of time, because their bones are going to completely vanish, or they're going to become so brittle, and so on and so forth. But it is one incredible example of the way in which gravity presents itself to us in such a rich way. That's to say, on one level, a dense planet represents, if you like, a motor, an engine, a source, and I mean, I encountered this in actually something that Brian Boigon brought my attention to 25 years ago, which was a different notion of membrane, which was when he brought Chuck Yeager's a very small summary of his understanding of the way he created a whole new relationship to space-time in his mastery of a fighter, of an airplane, shall we say, one of the greatest fighter pilots, but also the guy who broke the sound barrier, and in other words, also engaged all of those forces and the effects that they would have on his biology, because obviously breaking the sound barrier was believed it would kill you. It would, and because the pressures, the G forces, et cetera, were so great. But more important than that is he discovered something that he referred to as the ragged edge when he was exploring the way in which what Brian calls motion and movement and gravity and the whole matrix of relations, which had to be intuited, they had to be grasped, they had to be integrated into a total, into a design machine, if you like, in order for him to be able to find the opening to the outside, which was to get, and he did two things. He was the first, I believe, to actually go beyond the, what's it called, the barrier, the whatever you call it, the death barrier, etc. He took his airplane right up beyond, right into space. He was the first to bring an airplane up into space. And secondly, he was the first to take an airplane beyond, if you like, that rigid seeming barrier, which people believe you could not transgress, of the speed of sound, or whatever it is, what do you call it? The sound barrier. So I want to point out that the ragged edge became, I wrote an article about this many, many years ago. The ragged edge became an entirely new way of understanding the membrane, shall we say, the interface, because it was a place, it was a pathological place. It was a place of immense revelation, but it was also a place of immense access to realities that had never been fully grasped before. And his capacity to grasp it in his body, in his nervous system, in a passive way, in the sense that he was able to create an intuitive machine, and he was able to inhabit the ragged edge. And that is where, if you like, his capacity to find the opening into the other universe, to pierce the membrane, if you like, and to do it safely, and so on and so forth. I've always felt that that was the beginning. I mean, this discovery in the article I wrote was almost bloody well 30 years ago. But I feel that you guys are both working in this domain. You are both, in a certain sense, probing this area. So I would like to know whether you guys would like to speculate a bit on that. And since this is my hope to be the last time I talk before turning it over to the others, I do want to say that in a recent Zoom session with Alexandra Yeshka, we encountered a similar concept where she invoked the idea of the ground plane and the willful ignorance in the typical design world of considering the constitutive role that everything below the ground plane plays in determining the operations of what takes place in the domain that architecture has typically considered to be its area of concern. What she basically showed us is you can't do anything proper any longer by remaining within the boundaries of that old and traditional area of concern. I believe you guys are dealing with the exact same thing now, is bringing attention to that which exists outside of the boundary and all of the new ways of thinking about engaging, and it's a dangerous and beautiful place with entirely new conditions of what exists outside of that boundary. In her case, it was understanding the complexity of soil and no longer, and replacing that with the idea of ground. But what I did want to mention is a wonderful book which came out a few years ago, which was called Deep. And it was ostensibly a brilliant journalist's examination of what had been learned through the penetration of a domain, which is exactly the oceans, by the human organism, who began sometime around 25 years ago to explore and to enter into the depths of the ocean without equipment, without protective membranes, so to speak, and who discovered internal to the human evolutionary endowment apparatuses and capacities which for unknown reasons had been placed there, known as the mammalian dive reflex, in which the experience of free diving, that's to say, going without any instruments or without any artificial protections, and going deep down into the hugely pressurized domains of deep ocean without even breathing mechanisms. That's to say, they began to discover access to life-supporting gases, which exist in other parts of the body completely separate from the lungs, because the lungs get compressed to almost golf balls at the depths that these guys are going. And oxygen is both processed, and nitrogen and all the other gases, in entirely different ways. I can go on and on about it. It's a beautiful book. But what it ultimately represents is a kind of first cartography. It's an outer space. It's a first cartography, including videos and beautiful ballets that occur down there. But I wanted to say this, is that this idea was invoked for me, not necessarily by the systematic presentation of what Barbara gave us, but a single detail. And that was this guy Kittinger, if that's what his name is, I may have grabbed it wrong, who did the first skydive, if you like, from outside the troposphere, and who discovered that in that frictionless environment, obviously oxygenless environment as well, he experienced something which was tantamount to a complete out-of-body experience, in the sense that he did not perceive his motion or his movement through space, because in fact he was space. Now, that is a very, very common experience in deep water divers, and it takes place at a very specific place in the underwater realm. It takes place right after the point where the body becomes compressed and no longer is buoyant, and down to a certain level. There is this, and it is accompanied by an extraordinary psychic transformation, which is well documented, and so on and so forth. I wanted to bring this up because it is part of what needs to, and I'm talking about this because it is not only a new and expanded understanding of the environment that the architect needs to be taking into account, but it transforms old ideas, but it also teaches us that the environment is not only a physical domain, but it is also a psychic one. And that is my last statement, I hope, for today.
Sanford, just to underscore your example with James Nestor and The Deep, which you recommended I read, and I read it voraciously. The other aspect of that research that he did, he touched on briefly, but it was so central to my understanding of what's going on here today a bit, that he touched on the anti-binary way in which communication occurs underwater between whales. Echolocation, clicking across 1,000 kilometers around the globe, and they transact information in a different field of operation, even though it's in the same ordinary environment that the membrane of our bodies is in, and we're augmenting it in a different way. But I thought what he brought up to me was that reality for us, if you remove the binary, the non-binary, you take out the binary and make it non-binary, there are different ways in which reality can operate, all kinds of different ways. Barbara's really familiar with that in her reality. You brought it up over and over again this morning. But I'm just saying that, you know, we tend to move towards binarizing things very quickly, and we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't commit to that kind of existential cartography, and because there's so much difference in the categorical imagination of membranes and difference in environments that are sustained under the same realm, under the same non-ordinary reality.
First of all, that's brilliant. Thank you for bringing that part up, and you're 100% right. I just wanted, for the audience, I just want to point out that, yes, that was one of the incidental discoveries that became integrated in the survey work that Nestor did while studying the underwater realm. That's to say that there are mammals whose behaviors were completely, our understanding of aquatic mammal behavior was frankly deeply challenged by what was discovered down there. And what Brian talks about binary, first of all, I want to say is not, the real problem probably is to de-binarize at this point, rather than, you know, just simply learn to not to binarize, though they're both very important. The point that Brian's making, of course, is the way in which acoustic and tactile, haptic sensing occurs in a dense environment among mammals. That's to say, very, very highly encephalized, very sophisticated mammals with very sophisticated communication systems, but also who have a very rich social, communicative, and what is now suspected to be spiritual economy and ecology. Which is to say this, is that these animals, very often dolphins and certainly whales, will go to depths which are so astoundingly deep and altering, in the sense the pressures at 10,000 feet are so great that they utterly transform the biology of these animals. Now, what was discovered, and they've even been seen, they've been photographed, and by the way, they're going down to places where there is no light whatever, which of course is telling us very importantly that they don't really use their eyes in any interesting way, because they can pick up so much information through vibration. And they are constantly in vibratory communication with one another. But they have seen whales aggregating sometimes by the hundreds, and who organize themselves in arrays, in circles, in a vertical position at 10,000 feet. My own personal interpretation of this is that it is almost like it is almost a ceremonial and psychically altered, almost religious practice. Why do they go that deep? It is hard to hunt down there, but they do some hunting down there. Why do they go down there to commune? I think we need to begin to acknowledge that because those depths alter their state of mind, they alter their body state, which is the term used by Damasio, Smale, Ledoux, and others. I think we need to also understand this, is that we learned this also in the book. I learned that when a dolphin echolocates in order to assess a human or even another dolphin or any other animal, they don't see the contour. They don't see the outline of the animal. They see its full depth. They know if the animal has recently eaten. They know if it's carrying a child. They know what its, shall we say, its hydration levels are. They can read a lot. They see everything inside of the body, because the acoustic information picks up so much more than the simple outline and contour. What that also, of course, tells us is that we are living in a two-dimensional universe. However, what the deep book also showed us is that humans are adapted for a much broader engagement with the environment. And it is also true that the acoustic space, if you like, and the pickup, the information pickup in a dense environment, regardless of what it is very much, shall we say, in play when we today need to begin to produce a fully integrated, let's say, environmental human design, shall we say, interface. Now, again, I want to bring this up because I believe that both yours and Barbara's work represent pathological phenomena in Kurt Goldstein's sense, in which we are looking at non-routine conditions, whose purpose ultimately will be to reveal to us new pathways for terrestrial engagement.
Well, what I can read from what you said, Sanford, is that you're sort of propagating much more towards a much more multisensory environment, and that we have been neglecting a lot of senses we actually have. And that's a very sort of, that is a topic which is very much studied in space, because what happens is actually that when crews leave Earth and they, go on these longer duration missions, or let's say they would venture onto Mars, that they suddenly come from from an environment which has a lot of stimuli into an environment which is, which doesn't have everything we are used to, not the smells, not the light changes, not the, not the different, materials, textures, sounds, everything. And you always see that when astronauts come back to Earth, the way they suddenly respond, like they say, they respond in a way that they, particularly pick up, the birds singing or the smell of the grass or something like that. And so the psychologists and human performance people working for space exploration missions, they have been trying to identify, and that is very closely connected to the design of the space and to architecture, is they have been trying to identify, okay, what is it, what is really then missing, or what do we need, and how do we recreate these an environment which has, again, these light rhythms, for example, because that is something we are very much adapted to. Or, how can we introduce different kinds of, what kind of sensors can we introduce which sort of compensate the different levels we have here on Earth. So, and this also, I mean, that is, I think, the interesting thing, that for me personally, that changing this perspective and looking at it from another point of view, that suddenly, the awareness rises towards all these, like, they seem details, but they're actually very vital for our life. And then one thing, Sanford, coming back to your zero gravity, I mean, and the experience, it is, there was one astronaut commander, he once described, as soon as people, sort of escape the gravitational forces of Earth and the rattling of the rocket and the G-forces, and they sort of, they start floating, everybody starts smiling. So it's something it's like, it's sort of the compensation of a drug. And you probably also know that when you're going on a roller coaster, sort of simulating these different gravitational levels, that, you also, most times you're also smiling. So that there is something to it, that this kind of different sensation, and it's sort of also, one possibly could say, the lightness, the not having gravity sort of in best case also creates this lightness of thinking, or this kind of grasping the different perspective.
I believe it has to do with a memory, with an expansion that occurs because one becomes reconnected to a state before the mind had imposed the workable boundary, shall we say, the boundary required in order to navigate the world. And I believe that it has to do with amniotic pre-individual bliss, a kind of perinatal state. That's what I believe the smile is about. Now, I'm aware that a certain portion of the population, because of illness or something, didn't have a wonderful time in the womb and may not have that same smile. But nonetheless, I believe it has to do with some, shall we say, ontogenetic experience of the human. And I think that it is a place from which one can learn greatly. But that's enough for now.
But Barbara, to your point, the euphoria of weightlessness that's just self-discovered, I think, is when they get happy. They get happy, I think, because they go through ego lock, complete selfless identification of a new environment that they don't have to depend on walking in or moving around. This is what I imagine. My imagination is speculating that moving into an environment that you no longer are dependable for existing in, and you can float, let's say, you become euphoric because you lose a sense, not in a negative way, but you can dispatch your sense of selfness, and you go into an ego state of loss and become something other with the universe.
Well, I think I agree with Brian 100%. I just want to invoke one thing here, and this is where a lot of the conversations around virtual reality, the use of virtual reality, and even virtual reality, not just as a way of organizing the environment, but also of using it as an exploratory domain in neuroscience, et cetera. I think that this thing that Brian's invoking, I'm just going to use a term that's being kicked around because it was developed by a German philosopher named Thomas Metzinger. In a way, to say it in another way, Metzinger refers to the ego tunnel. And I think what Brian is basically saying here, it's this moment of release from the tunnel, and the discovery that we too are outside the tunnel, even though we very rarely have access to that experience. And I think it's an important one. I think it's what space is all about, because space is not just outer space. It's all of the space that's on the other side of all of the boundaries.
If I may jump in here, I think that's it's really great that we're having this discussion, because I think what we've heard, membrane, the Book of the Dead, kind of attachment without attachment, is really not only kind of pushing new, like kind of destroying boundaries that we've drawn in ontology, but also epistemologically. So I think, I had to think about Whitehead and his theory of prehension, and that is kind of part of the organismic philosophy and a kind of radical empiricism, because in the end, what this all points to is that we are embedded, deeply embedded, and that the kind of membranes and, there's a dissolution sometimes because there's an attachment without attachment. So what he's talking about in prehension is basically that it's a pre-perceptual process of selection, that we get kind of like attracted to something, but what is not attracting us is not lost, but it becomes potential for something new. And I think that is beautiful in terms of, not only how we think about material on this planet as part of the biosphere that Vernadsky, for example, identified as life being really at core part of this biosphere and the planet. I think it's also showing us that in terms of thought and in terms of information and process, there's this embeddedness there. And I think it's really beautiful because I think both of you are showing us that the outer space and membranes are challenging us to go beyond these bounds that we have established and rather think about it as open systems, not as closed systems. And that, Whitehead talks about ingression, and that kind of overlapping, I think, is very important, not in terms of only, material existence, but also the mental in this world. So I think that's really beautiful.
Victoria, well said. I have just a quick question for you about Whitehead. Is Whitehead the one who, maybe Sanford could answer it if you don't know the information. Did Whitehead evolve the concept of the creod?
I don't know. Sanford, do you know that?
Well, okay, no, the answer is not. That was Waddington. However, it is important to know that for that generation of theoretical biologists, and it's not widely known, Whitehead was their guide. Whitehead was their guide. That goes for virtually all of the English theoretical biologists, Joseph Needham, Waddington, and so forth. They're not really related topics, by the way, Brian. What are you thinking?
I was reminded of the creod. A creod is considered to be a behavioral valley, a valley that's created by something repeating through it. In my case, I studied cartoons and watched them have behavioral valleys, creods, that they could come up over the valley and change into another environment. But a creod is not about attachment, to your point about being intrigued by this place of association and disassociation and not necessarily possessing it, but moving ahead, moving the world ahead. Creods do that. The creotic world of valley behavior and the geometry of valleys is very dynamic and doesn't own the behavior of the subject moving through it. It merely is a vehicle, or not a roadway. It's somewhere between a vehicle and a pathway that conducts movement and between matter, really between matter and vibration.
I think that's really interesting. And Whitehead also, for Whitehead, in the end, matter and mind are not separate. So if I made that sound like it, that's not what I mean. It's more like that it's basically different phases within the process, but it's all the same process. And I think it's kind of interesting.
Anybody who starts studying Whitehead, every one of us, and it's an endless topic, and it's hard as hell, and it's wonderful to watch, to see, frankly, people like Victoria grasping so much of it and staying with it, because it really takes a sustained effort. Anyone who does usually begins with science in the modern world. And one of the things that you just cannot grasp fully in your first 4 or 5 readings of that book is a place where he ends up. And that is to say, he becomes very, very obsessed ultimately with the idea of vibration. And you know that, I mean, I'm not there yet, but it's very clear, even from that book, that that is ultimately where he sees, that's ultimately where he gets to, if you like. That's ultimately where the process problem ends up. And he sees it probably as the keystone. And I just have to say that that's a little bit, you know, it's a little bit of the, it's a clue. It's a clue about how radical a departure we need to achieve. How, look, it's not that easy to give up Cartesianism, shall we say, completely. It's a multi-step operation, and one can begin to have enormous results right away. But to give it up completely is, you know, that's a long process for all of us. And what's fascinating is we already know from the Dalai Lama, from Whitehead, we know it from, you know, advanced physics. We ultimately know that it has to do with a wave. And mapping out the full cosmology of the wave, it's on one level, it's happening everywhere. It's so accessible, but it really goes very, very far. I really want to say that because intimations of it are, we can grasp them anywhere, including, you know, looking at echolocation, of course, in a certain sense, and how much more detailed perception of the environment is when it is shifted away from the eye. And then when the brain follows that shift, it takes us to places we have to be brave and fierce to go there.
You know, Sanford, David Bohm, in his book, Wholeness and Implicate Order, right? He argues about matter and waves being interchangeable.
He's an astronaut, like you guys.
Yeah, like that's an incredible idea that a wave could be interchanged with matter. That's like unheard of. Well, at least was unheard of to me, inconceivable to me until I read his stuff. And it's not about echolocation and clicking that affects a big whale underwater, you know, in the, you know, in an area that I have know nothing about. But the transposition of a wave to matter and back and forth, that's a real world. That's incredible to me. That's a membrane. That's a membrane right there.
You know, well, okay, that goes back to late quantum physics. That's Schrödinger and what's his name? The German guy who stayed behind in Germany and didn't emigrate. What's his name? Guys, help me. Victoria, can you help me? Anyway, this, and then the wave function collapse. I mean, that was one of the great moments, of course, in the study of matter. But that's an idea that's been around for 100 years. And it is the hardest thing to get. The question, of course, is, it turns out that operates at a macroscopic scale and at many other scales that aren't part of normal space-time as well, which is why neurobiological and experience studies of the modalities of experience and other things are beginning to look at these models, if you like, or are beginning to discover that such a huge amount of progress, or shall we say, or expansion, can be achieved by beginning to think in those terms. Barbara, how, I mean, you know, obviously you're looking at forces that need to be protected, and protected by boundaries, because the humans are a ready-made object, if you like. They have been generated within an ecological context, and that cannot, let's just say 90% of a human's biology requires the maintenance of of conditions in their environment in order for them to survive. But I think it's possible to say that 10% of a human, particularly those things that emerged with the plasticity of brain and the plasticity of perception and the plasticity of behavior, are actually continually searching for expansion that goes beyond the human somatic constraints, which have to do with their, shall we say, their phylogenesis in Earth ecology. Now, space travel represents perhaps, I don't know what you think about this, a much deeper, late arriving need of the human to transcend. In other words, the human, from the moment they developed such a sophisticated prefrontal cortex, and from the moment that human beings, through their healing practices and their trance experience and their religious life and all of those things which are deeply rooted, if you like, in their experience and in their biology, have always compelled them, if you like, especially when we became human, compelled them to begin to explore what's on the other side of the boundary. And therefore, how do you consider the will to space in terms of human anthropology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I start with something very hands-on, just to explain a little bit, and start with zero G. When the astronauts, when they get big cargo bags, what you do on Earth is if you have to carry a crate or a box from one place to the other, you take it into your hands, you carry it somewhere. But in zero gravity, what happens is you need your hands to move around. So the arms and legs are sort of switched in their functions, and you put the cargo bags between your legs, and then move with your arms. And when you and Sanford before quite nicely described the underwater environment. And I think that while, zero gravity is completely different, it has a sort of, there may be some things which overlap. So the ideal, so of course, humans are not ideal for zero gravity at all. Humans are very adaptable, and one can sort of also tune them, I would say. But the ideal, for example, the ideal living creature for zero gravity would probably be more somebody like an octopus. That would be more ideal. So if we go very far out, and if we really imagine millions of years living in space, then maybe we would sort of evolve more towards that sort of more spherical core body with some arms, like
but hydraulic locomotion as well, right? Hydraulic or pneumatic locomotion.
Yes, something like that. Yeah. So like Platon described in one of his books, the circular double humans, which were then separated by Zeus. I don't know if not everybody has read this story, but something like that. So but then on the other, and then coming back, I started with the box, and then went towards the octopus, and then coming back to something more down to earth is I recently spoke with a human performance expert pharmacologist from NASA, and she said, well, what'll happen, especially when we go to Mars, so that's not very far out in the future, not the octopus future, then we probably have to start specific treatment, because we will have to face radiation, a lot of radiation, and we have no measures. But it is possible, or we could imagine, and we could work on pharmaceuticals which could sort of compensate that. And so in that sense, there are different I think, different levels of alterations. It's just a matter of how far one looks into the future. I once went to an artificial life conference, and one of the Japanese AI experts, he said to me, you know, what are you, you know, how can you even conceive, you know, a mission with humans? Why not just take sort of the intelligence and go there and, you know, create the intelligence and go and explore the universe and just forget about the humans, just leave them on Earth in their, you know, tiny, thin little zone of comfort they're able to live in.
Yeah, it's the type of thing you encounter with technologists. They live in a world. Well, they don't live in a world, actually, and they don't know that they don't live in a world, because the minute you bring a world in, you bring in all of those complexities and richnesses that have to do with flesh. Okay, open it up to the others there.
Maybe I can chat after this comment of Sanford. In terms of, I don't know if you are familiarized with Sean Bernal, this Irish scientist who pioneered the X-ray in crystallography, and he wrote an essay. The name is "The World," and the world, the flesh, and the devil, an inquiry into the future of the three enemies of the rational soul. And in that thesis, the first part of the thesis is about future, which is how we started this session today, talking about future. And one of the theses, I mean, when he mentioned the world, he's mentioned it like the interplanetary travel, no? That is something that even was taken from Kepler in certain ways. And this idea of runaway, no, from the world because we don't have enough food or we don't have enough space or whatever. And the second thesis, which is the flesh, it is like the brain will be connected to a machine. This is a 1929 essay. No, so the brain will be connected to the machine. So in this way, we humans will avoid suffering. And the third thesis, which is related with desire, is like all this only will be possible if we want it. If we want this, so in these terms, it's like technology in the context of human in a certain way, that this only will be possible, all this kind of technological, I don't know if call it evolution or what, but it will be only possible if we want this. Because the day that we don't want this anymore, and this is all related with also with this point that you mentioned before about virtual reality, or even artificial intelligence. The day that we don't want to be watched anymore or controlled anymore, we decide not to share our private life with everyone, for example, we can't turn back to a different situation. So, and this is also related with Ortega y Gasset's point of view about the role of the human will in all this. So this is like more like a comment about, and is trying to relate this with previous comments about the idea of the body or the disembodied, no? How we, in a way, believe that can, I don't know, have like a different kind of life if we don't have a body. And I believe this is also something that we talk with Slavoj Žižek, even when I'm not totally agree with him about a lot of things. But anyway, I believe that this is like, and maybe I have a question, which is like more like, I mean, I'm an architect. And so I have like a more architectural question in terms of, from a material perspective about certain things that Barbara was mentioned. And that this, my question could be like, what are the like the political or the economical implication of the membrane, no? The concern of the membrane, because in architecture we have like these things, this idea of the elimination of the joint, for example, no? So like the membrane is like an attempt to eliminate the joint and to trying to avoid filtrations. No, so I was thinking if because in a way then it's also related with this Sarah Polo book of the the ecologies of the envelope. No, that in one way he traced like a kind of alternative tectonic lineage, based of the idea of the membrane for architects. So I could see that you mentioned like the concept of the barrier, no, and how we stop. So my question, like what do you think that are the implication, the political and economical implication of the idea or the concept of membrane? From whatever point of view you want to mention. I don't know if it's about architecture itself or if it's more about your approach or new approach in terms of author spaces.
Could I just jump in there and just say something?
Yes, please.
At the back of my mind, I mean, throughout this discussion, which has been really amazing, thank you so much for all this, it's been this kind of idea about, what is architecture? What is that membrane that actually defines in some way architecture? And Marina says, I'm an architect. And what do you mean by that? I guess in some ways it's kind of interesting about how architecture's relationship to its other, in some sense, in a way. I've always thought that architecture, in terms of these kind of cocoons, as we say, membranes, has been this too cozy kind of in existence, and it needs to be destabilized by something that challenges the very definition or understanding of what it is. And that's why I think people like Sanford coming in from outside, and indeed today, Brian coming from, is really important to actually kind of keep us alive and to challenge us and to rethink what it is to be an architect. At the same time, there is on the part of architects this kind of like, someone described them as being like these kind of, is it ravens, the little birds that kind of pick silver things? I forget the name of them, but anyway, there's one bird that goes around collecting these silvery items, and this colleague was telling me that kind of that's what architects are like. Magpies, is it magpie? Magpies, they keep on stealing kind of ideas from outside. They bring them, incorporate them into architectural domain, and they kind of feed off them in a kind of strange way. But you end up with a situation whereby, well, okay, fine. If architecture becomes everything, then it becomes nothing. And the very definition of what architecture is actually is kind of at stake right now in an interesting way. So I just want to ask Marina, what do you mean by you say I'm an architect? What do you mean by that?
I'm a materialist thinker.
Marina, I want to add something to the question. What about you being an architect? And when you began, it was super interesting to me that you talked about the will to do something, right? And so does the will have something to do with you being an architect and raising these questions?
Yeah, I believe that, there is like for example, for me, like a kind of definition of being an architect, which is like in certain ways we can think about other disciplines, but in a way that we try to organize it in the material aspect of this. So in a way that at least why I feel I'm an architect is because I believe that I feel I work like organizing matter into the space. At least that's how I define my practice. But in a way, it doesn't mean that I cannot think about, for example, philosophical aspect of my practice. But I think about this philosophical aspect through my practice. That's the difference. So maybe that's so in terms of the will, there is always an expression that we are not going to invent a wheel every day for architects, for example, in terms of novelty. And this is like a comment that always appear in architectural field. Like we cannot invent a wheel every Monday or something like that. And I believe that in certain ways it's true, but there is also at least one of my interests is to push forward the discipline in in new ways. So I'm an architect. I don't feel myself as a traditional architect, but I can define myself as an architect. So I don't know if it's exactly answering your question, but at least it's my position about this. So I don't know.
I mean, I just don't. I I think just going back to to the very beginning when Sanford was questioning, what the hell is theory in a way. I think in some ways some of these terms are a little bit difficult anyway because they're never. I mean, if they just take a static term, I mean, it's not. Is it so helpful? And to my mind, looking back on Sanford's suggestion that we call this whole kind of workshop really got the question mark. That seems to me actually really what theory should be about. Just kind of a certain incredulity, a certain questioning, a certain probing, and certain things. So, in a way, I don't find any static concepts so useful. What I find interesting is that process of continually negotiating and challenging and questioning what it might be, because it's always mutating and changing. I don't know. That's my particular viewpoint, but.
Yeah, and about theory is like, in a way, I can see that theory, because there is also like the discussion of artificial intelligence, this through logics. Now that it comes from the Greeks, like the idea of the rational thought in terms of logos. So it's like the algorithmical way that we can think. Like we have a previous theory, and then we go through the practice, and then you have like the contextual the rationality, in a way that you can learn from the context. Even if you don't have like a previous theory, you can deduce your theory after you make something. So in that way, that's how I understand the theory in what I do, in terms of I do something and then I learn about what I did, and then I can, in a way, like continue my practice, whatever my practice will be, because theory is also a way of practice. It has its own matter in certain ways. So but this is why I'm in a way, in that terms, I agree more with what Manuel de Landa said in our previous session, in the relationship between philosophy and architecture. And this is like an important rationalization of what we do.
It's a beautiful statement. You did a beautiful job. Oh, I'm live. Yeah, you did a beautiful job just now, actually, of articulating. When I made that joke earlier about referring to the old theory versus the new theory, I think you just gave us a very beautiful entry into what would be delineated by the new theory. Now, I'm going to let you put what you just said on paper and make it available to the rest of the world. I'm going to ask you to please do that sometime soon before you forget it. But I am going to at least invoke one other thing that Victoria said earlier. For no seeming reason, when discussing Whitehead, she invoked a term which was radical empiricism, which is a very unusual and very specific notion introduced by William James, but which is in some ways being rediscovered today for a variety of reasons. I won't go into it right now, but I think what you just described could classify as radical empiricism. And I think that we all need to work that out, because that is the new theory. Now, it's not the new theory simply because it is more deferent to practice. It's because I think we need to recognize, even in that term, which I thought was practically a parody, that term of rationality in the so-called Irish physics, is an absolutely preposterous, one-dimensional, completely, shall we say, crippled notion of reality that was put on the table by the idea of there's the rational and there's everything else. Because what James has shown us, and what a lot of contemporary science has shown us, it's the everything else that ultimately matters now, and it matters more than ever. Now, we need to also be able to distinguish when a new being arises among us, such as, shall we say, AI, to begin to ask ourselves whether it belongs to that flat universe, shall we say, of the of the, you used the term, Marina, two different types of rationality. What was it? What did you call it? What kind of rationality?
One is the logos, like this, like more related with the, like finally is what the history who won, no? The Aristotle's and Platon and this kind of, it's taken from Heraclitus from the beginning, but yes,
Well,
it's the idea of the logos. And the other, yes, and the other is like more like the contextual rationality.
Oh yes, contextual rationality. Oh, I don't know. I just thought that was a beautiful, that's a beautiful term as well. I'd never heard it before. I don't know if you invented it. But you know, you could build a world around that. So
yeah,
if you
it's more like
invented
a practical reason in certain way. It's more like a practical reason. But I believe that finally it's like related with this godness of metis. You remember like this idea of the when you're in the ceiling, you cannot like find your way back to home because you cannot see the stars, and then you need to feel it's like more like it's related with Greek philosophy, but with the idea of the matter of wisdom in certain ways. So it's like a kind of you know, prudence or wisdom, which is like different to the rational idea. So it's like, and I don't know, my brain always makes strange connections, but I was thinking about one day I made this question to Bruce Mao about creativity, and he gave me the example of the fog of war.
Yeah.
So the idea of the fog of war is like you cannot have like this kind of previous strategy. You don't know who are your enemies, who are your friends in the battle, you know, in the field. So you need to try to follow your in a way like your intuition, no? And this is like the same idea of when you're in the ship and you cannot see the stars to guide you, but anyway, the sailors could come back to their own lands without seeing exactly what they were, but they can do it anyway, based on certain knowledge that is become from the experience, no? Also, so and in this way, I believe that this like this idea of wisdom. So it's not like the logos idea of the reason. It's more like something that you can develop when you are in specific circumstances that you cannot predetermine. In a way, you cannot like.
Well, there's a lot of richness in the direction that you're going. I just want to say these sessions, I do not see these are not sessions to provide answers. These are sessions to change the framework of what an architect concerns themselves with. And I would say thanks for your contribution there. That's really all we're trying to do. Enough of this, and people will begin to realize that that the richness lies on the other side of the tradition right now.
Yeah, I learned something specific from you related to what Sanford just said. As I was listening to you, I was like, oh, Marina is actually incorporating things in the world into her world, not integrating them, not predetermining how they integrate. And you have a capacity that's extraordinary as far as I'm concerned to incorporate the world into your world and not necessarily integrate it as an architect or otherness, whatever that is. But that's a big deal to me. That's refreshing intellectually.
I'd like to come back, if there's still some time, to the question, Marina, you had. So it was about the implications, economic, political, or whatever, and it's more directed towards architecture. And I think what always drives me is that, especially now, since we are really, working with Thales Alenia on the next lunar space station, is that, it's sort of, you create a vessel, which is a machine, basically. And, sometimes with the International Space Station now, it looks a little bit better because everything's cladded off the machine. But, in you know, when you look at the Russian tradition, or now at the next space station, then it's very omnipresent. So you're creating this machine, and then you put the humans inside, and then, you know, we as architects try to create this environment. And when we look at houses, you know, when we look at how we are sort of you know, outfitting our houses, there's a lot of plumbing, there's a lot of, you know, ventilation, of tubing, you know, water, everything, but it's all, you know, it's all hidden. But actually it's sort of, you know, or when you look at hospitals, they're sort of also machines. And what we do mostly is putting the humans inside these machines in one way or the other. So some are more intricate, some, you know, are less, you know, interesting in the way the spaces are formed. But I just wonder if we could, you know, and this becomes so so immanent with the spaceship, is that it's always about this biosphere. And why not, you know, why can't we, you know, look towards something which is more, when we see it more in organistic, like an organism, you know, from that point of view, and try to approach it on that level, whether it is a building, a spaceship, it doesn't really matter, because it's, everything is an environment humans live in. And so we probably can also sort of, you know, create a better connection with the actual environment, the larger context we have.
Thank you. If I may jump in here real quick, I just wanted to give at least one participant the ability to ask a question. And if everyone is okay, we'll just stay on for 5 more minutes. We're over the mark, but I think we have a little bit more time. So Seth had a question, Seth Embry, if you could unmute yourself.
Just say, I think we can carry on, and probably, I don't want to go too long because everyone's going to reach a certain exhaustion point, but I don't think there's necessarily a constraint. I would suggest we can maybe wrap up at 1:30. But I mean, just to see, I certainly would just want to second that we have a bunch of people very patiently watching, listening, and I've been trying to find out where everyone is. I know that there's someone in Romania, there's someone in Iran, and so on and so on. So it'd be great to try and involve people as much as possible. So yeah, Seth, yeah.
Hi, I'm actually currently in Kentucky, so just to answer your question, Neil. So I just wanted to react to Barbara's earlier statement, and I thought it was very beautiful. So I'm curious as to whether the movement by orbital attractors to terrestrially, despite our best efforts at linearity, but that the combination of scale and gravity affect our perception in order to sublimate the obviousness of our quotidian and earthly motion pathways. I mean, obviously we're all objects in space to some degree and are subject to the same rules that guide the galactic and cosmic bodies. But I just wonder, you know, if even without consciously being aware, we are using those sort of orbital pathways here, orbital attractors here in our motion pathways.
Yeah, what do you think? I think, I mean, if you know, if you take it as an image, as a picture, as a sort of, you know, thought, then probably you can also, you know, create these throughout your life or throughout a you know, specific period or within an architecture space or building. You probably can see these attractors and then sort of create these pathways around, towards, and so on. And it's probably then, you know, as an architect, I mean, when I talk about architecture, it's probably up to you then how you define it. But it's maybe, it's what I find, you know, I'm always looking for sort of associative images, you know, which I can use for, you know, understanding maybe principles, but also creating concepts for something completely different. And for that, I think it's quite useful. But well, as said, you know, when you change you know, when you're not bound to gravity anymore, then you're forced to, you know, work with orbital mechanics.
Yeah, just to add one thing to that, Barbara, you reminded me of, that's a good question, Seth, that you reminded me of this essay that was a transcript from what Gertrude Stein wrote, Composition as Explanation, in 1926. And she basically, what you're saying to me is that, to answer Seth's question, when you're in a new field, the composition is not explaining itself to you the way Gertrude Stein argued composition was explanation, or is explanation. That is for certain. That's what she was arguing for. And when you're in new routines, new modalities, like in outer space or in inner space in my case, and in quantum mechanics, and Sanford touched on that briefly, these are places that can't explain through composition necessarily. And we need to find new means of explaining these places. And that's up in the air, in the oxygen, so to speak.
There's a question in the chat, and maybe I can just read it out, from Pedro Oscar, unless Pedro wants to ask it himself.
Hello, hi, and you can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, where are you?
Okay, I am from south of Brazil, Florianopolis. Okay, thanks for all the informations here. And I have first, all this information make me think in different ways, and how can be the future for architects, and how can be this future for teaching and architect teachers. So, and we talk about different kinds of materials, different kinds of technology, different kinds of emotions that we can feel in the space, or when we broke these memories, we broke this space of the architecture and the space, like the space environment, how I can say this. And I think how we talk about these different technologies, but we don't think about we think, but how the people who will living in this place. We have a lab like the ESS. We can see how the astronauts are living in the space, but how we can imagine it. We can live in Mars and Moon, or even space, or how can we live with the other kinds of intelligence, like robots in other space, like Venus in farways. I kind of say, we need to think the architecture not like the material, or have can be this hard environment, but we also have to think in the people who will live there. But to these people, how can I say, can live well in the moon, live well in Mars, live well in space, just not thinking about the material and technology, but how you can imagine this situation. How can you imagine the people living this break memory or break space? It's like this way. Thanks.
I just wonder, Brian, if you want to go first, because, with your opus inter opera, I think you might have, a good starting point for that. I mean, I can certainly answer that, but maybe we reach sort of further into a speculative realm.
Sure. Well, I don't really have a specific answer, but that's good that you provoked me. So it in my universe of alternative spatial modeling and existence, using quantum mechanics as a springboard, basically, the problem is that there is not a preoccupation in that world for me to represent myself or represent others, but to figure out how to occupy different realities simultaneously. And that becomes the chore, the job of an architect of the future, to be able to render the world and the universe in different multiverses that don't necessarily traverse one another, but sustain themselves without entering into a conflict of interest of any sort. So I'm just at the beginning of that. So that's not something that I have a lot of expertise in, but it's an area that I've recently decided that reality, as far as I'm concerned, is not opposed to non-ordinary reality, but reality for me is an instance of a condition that's required in different routines and different modalities that move away from the idea of me representing myself, of me explaining myself, as Gertrude Stein would use the word composition as explanation. So I don't have an answer, but I do have a conflict of interest in that area. Barbara.
Yeah. So I think it's very, I'm just reading a book by Stephen Baxter. It's describing, it's called Evolution, and it's sort of describing, I haven't come far, like 1/3 or so, but I can see where it's leading to. But it's describing basically how our ancestors millions of years ago, starting from the dinosaur age, have become the social creature that we are now, amongst other things. And so one thing is, I can't tell you more about that right now because I haven't read through it, and I didn't make any speculations on what but maybe one could sort of draw from this kind of process of becoming more aware of oneself and of the group, and sort of starting interacting with the group and planning and strategic group action and interaction, and going further and further. But so maybe one can learn from that and extrapolate maybe what it'll be in 1,000 or 5,000 years in space. Right now we can only see that there's a sort of whenever you put a group together and you sort of have this special group of astronauts, they create specific cultures, rituals. So the ritual is very important. There are a lot of different rituals which are very specific, like planting a tree, signing, I don't know, whenever you board, you open the hatch, you go on to float into space station, you sign first, then there's the eating the bread together, and so on and so forth. Then there's language. So there's a specific language. It's sort of this kind of very military technical language, but it's also the everyday, what are you talking about, the food, how you're doing, or things like that. So that is also changing. I mean, these are very little steps. It's only after 50 years. So I don't know what's going to happen, if we really go further and longer. People are speculating already. So what will we, when we go to Mars, which will be a completely different dimension, what will we leave behind? What will we take with us? What it is also, I mean, culture is, individual culture, the cultures we come from is so, how can I say, is so within our lives. We hardly realize that. We only realize that when we start living together and have to be sort of isolated, whether it's in Antarctica or on the moon or in a submarine or wherever, with that specific crew and these different with different cultural backgrounds. So it's not the gender aspect that is an easy part. It's the culture, because it's so ingrained in us, and it's hard to sort of do things differently, think things differently. But what the actual social setup will be, I think first probably will, settlement on the moon might look like a research station in Antarctica. That's a good sort of role model. But further and further, we don't know, because or I wouldn't know. There's also there's then what if we meet extraterrestrial intelligence? One of my favorite books by Stanislav Lem Solaris, creates this kind of immersion, this planet, which is an intelligent organism, much more intelligent than the human being, and sort of starts getting, only communicates via our psyche actually. And then there's this, can't think of her name now, very famous, I think English writer, and she just describes us on planet Earth as sort of some study objects, part of a huge galactic universal research experiment. And it's quite funny, but it's also quite tragic when, she takes an outside look onto us. But so yeah, I think that's it. That's not, there's a lot of speculation and a lot of, I think, nice stories in science fiction one can sort of maybe draw inspiration from.
Barbara, may I quickly ask you what you use when you teach? What do you ask your students to read or look at or think about? And did you like the movie Martian?
Yes, I like the movie. I like the movie Martian. I think particularly because the ending is a sort of, is a different ending, but I also think it was a good movie. There are some things I didn't like about it, but that's fine. And teach, I was, maybe I give you an example. I think I had a 1-year guest professorship at the University of Kassel. I was mentioning that to Victoria before because she's from Kassel. And the first exercise was for the students to put themselves into zero gravity on Earth, use the media of the movie, of the film, and sort of create a film of themselves in zero gravity. Because I thought, it's important to get a like a very concrete experience, sort of create a performance and get this kind of experience. And the second exercise was isolate yourself 24 hours completely in your room, as if you would be, during COVID times maybe, or without connection, without anything. Just to, and make a notebook, create a notebook, photos, and sort of documentation as a kind of introduction.
We've got a question in the chat from Samina Lorinc. I probably pronounced that wrong, who's in Romania, I think. Samina, do you want to ask that question? I mean, or you don't have to, but I can read it for you.
Hello, I can ask it. So it's Simina Lorenz. It's it's okay. Should I start the video?
Yes, if you can.
Oh,
Should be able to.
Hello.
Oh, yeah.
Hearing all this discussion and hearing about prudence, I have studied about phronesis and eros, not so much about thanatos, but made me think about the act of creation, namely poiesis, and beauty, not so much as kalon, so beautiful and good in the same time, but it's a contemporary understanding as a layer, a membrane, if I have to fit this discussion, a layer between, so the final step in architectural design. And I personally think beauty is much more than that. And this discussion encouraged me to go this way and continue thinking it and considering it not so much as a mere layer, but something much juicier and much profound than that. And especially the link between prudence and love and creation, creativity. And I have heard these ideas rolled in this discussion. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about this. I know it's a little bit off the topic because, you know, aesthetics and creation, it's a little bit philosophical, but it made me think of this.
So, but I get the sense maybe that you've got the answer there. But let's say what Sanford has to say.
No, I just want to say this. There's one word there that came as a surprise to me, Simina. Prudence? Did somebody say prudence?
Yes, I think, I don't want to be mistaken, but I think Marina said it at some point, and also mentioned creativity, and it made the click in my mind, and many many other ideas were very well linked together when hearing this.
But let me just say this, prudence is not obviously linked to those. I think it's your mind we need to be looking at right now. What do you see? What do you mean by prudence? Or what did you understand when you heard that?
I understand practical wisdom. So something maybe also linked to techne, to a way to craft, to I think craft it's a good thing, and all the wisdom and the intelligence that, and something that I think Barbara said about when going into the outer space and trying to match high technology with sort of a primitive way of building things, using what you find there. And also this linked me to this practical wisdom also, somehow.
Are you an architect?
Yes, I am.
Wow, okay. Practicing architect or a student?
I am a teacher, actually.
A teacher. I'm going to say, wow, I mean, your I would say your philosophical grounding is very, very fascinating, very interesting. I can only tell you this. I think you should keep going. Whatever it is you put together today, or whatever it is that you felt today was encouraging you to pursue, my only sense is that it's very important that you do it. And I'm not saying that just because, and that's not personal advice. That is selfish advice. I think we need you to do that. And I think you're already, look, not everybody understands this stuff, and not everybody is going to understand this stuff, but those who already do, it means they already have the intuition of where it can go. So that's all I have to say. Really, I think it's very fascinating that you received the things that we heard today and synthesized it this way. I think it's beautiful, and I feel really emphatically that you now should be brave and pursue it and see where it goes.
Thanks.
I mean, Simina, just to clarify, as I understand it, you've finished your PhD at Iomincu in architecture. Now you're a professor somewhere else in Romania.
Yes, I have finished my PhD, I think 3 years ago, or it's a little bit fuzzy in my head. But now I teach in Brasov, at the university in Brasov, and I teach more subjects related to culture and history of design, to descriptive geometry or graphic design. I teach many subjects there.
Did you study anywhere in Western Europe or the United States?
Yes, Western Union, Europe, sorry. I studied in Germany. I studied in France, a little bit in Italy, and I think that's it.
Well, you have a wonderful cosmopolitan mind.
Thank you.
Sabine, can I just throw something out there? Because I had a long history in Romania years ago, and I published a few books in Romanian. And it was really fascinating when things opened up, And actually, there's what I would say, Sanford. There's some very interesting people coming out of Romania, including one character called Doina Petrescu, who was the only architect I know who studied under Derrida. She did a PhD with Helen Sixu. So there's a really interesting world out there. But what I encountered when I went there, and we did a lot of things, but was the fact that there was a kind of progressive left wing, I don't know, whatever approach that was dominant in architecture in the West. And we would get to Romania and discover that the progressive thinkers were actually conservatives. It was the absolutely flipped round opposite of what I was used to. And I guess one of the things I'm discovering now is that the more we kind of bring the world together, the more we notice certain differences, which is kind of interesting in its own way. We actually have encountered a few different difficulties in terms of this particular workshops, because in China they want everyone to register for something, and we say no. In the West, you don't register, you don't give your personal data away. But you kind of encounter all these different oppositions, and you begin to realize that the world is absolutely not homogenous. I think it's by going into outer space you realize how different things are and how you recognize where you come from yourself.
I think it's very much like that, but going so much outside, so in the outer space of Romania, I think it helped me at least seeing different things and dreaming of following them, or at least challenging them. So I think that's the merit of going outer space for me.
But I mean, I want to say this, this is a bit inappropriate, but please publish in the West. Please publish in English.
That's very interesting. I have published 2 books in Romania, and I have the manuscripts also in English. So I have written it in English because I have worked in collaboration with Professor Alberto Perez Gomez, and in order for him to understand and make some corrections, I had to write it in English also. So I have the paper, the work in English, but I didn't know. So I'm relatively new in this area, and so the academic area, I'm meaning. And I didn't know where to start or where to go, who to contact. I didn't know.
Send your email to Neil, and I'll connect you with some places.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to kind of offer a thought, this kind of question. I mean, maybe I'm not following exactly from what Pedro's question was, but imagining a future in which the barriers of space have already been overcome. There's an interesting kind of question. If you've overcome all the barriers, how do you get anywhere? And on the one hand, I think outer space is, and I mean, whenever I'm teaching a studio in outer space, the problem is it's so constricting, so constraining. You, as Barbara was saying, you have to start off with these kind of cylinders or spheres or whatever. From a formal point of view, you are absolutely constrained. And despite the world of science fiction that would imagine all these possibilities, the reality, I mean, to Barbara's comment, what would a colony on the moon look like? You'd probably be underneath the regolith trying to avoid the radiation and things. It is so constricting. I normally, when my students, I give them the hard time and say, this is the, now just let your imagination run riot. But in some ways, I think in terms of if you can do anything in architecture, you need to have certain constraints, because I always say to my students, if a client comes to you and is like, I want to build me a building, if you know what the constraints are, if you know what the budget is, what the site is and things, you need to have all these kind of these issues. And I think in some ways we need to be able to establish those constraints in order to come up with an answer. I mean, one thing that Tom Main said is, it's really, when it comes to design, you have to be able to really define the question. What is the precise issue that you're dealing with? Otherwise you're kind of nowhere. And it kind of reminds me in some ways, I gave a course recently just now called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Artificial Reality, where it was an allusion to The Hitchhiker's Guide, where the problem is they come up with the answer, which is 42, but then they spend ages thinking, well, what was the question in some ways? And it seems to me we have to be able to formulate the question very precisely in order to get the right answer. And maybe I could throw that over to Barbara for a thought. You were just nodding, Barbara. I wondered if maybe
Yes,
you want...
yes. No, I was just thinking that's scientific practice. It's all about research questions. So it's, this is how you start off, and the better they're formulated, I think the better you can start off. It doesn't mean that you will at the end be able to answer that question, but you'll get somewhere. That's what I believe.
I mean, just to say that is precisely why, according to Elon Musk, this is his favorite book on philosophy. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is his favorite book on philosophy, because in his world, you've got to precisely define the questions. Otherwise, you're completely lost.
You know, I find it fascinating that you raise the issue in design constraints. That struggle I have with setting parameters, controls, they're called in my area of mathematical physics when I've tested things. Controls or constraints, when they come from one set of regimes of logic and not others, I find that limiting. But I agree with the idea of creating controls or constraints, but I don't agree with having them come from all from conventional operations like ecology, economy, etc. I mean, you know, like, for example, when Samina was talking, you know, I was thinking about this book that is really on mesmerization. It's a book written that's called The Psychoanalysis of Fire by Gaston Bachelard. And, you know, he discusses what does he think mesmerization is, and he uses fire. So those kinds of constraints like a fire and mesmerization, those don't happen. They're not out of happenstance in terms of economics. I'm not saying you're arguing that, but I'm saying that some constraints are way more conventional than others. And when people traverse the constraints and bring in other things like mesmerization and the fire, that to me is exciting and important.
So I'm just thinking that maybe we should be wrapping up things fairly soon. Maybe tomorrow I just realized it's Victoria's session, and I wonder if you want to just say a few words by way of kind of introduction to what you want to talk about tomorrow.
Yes, thanks, Neil. So tomorrow we'll be talking about kind of continuing the conversation about boundaries and membranes, but more shifting towards ecology and talking about, you know, living with and within other organisms. Barbara was mentioning the planet as an organism and kind of that, you know, that we integrate it in larger systems. And that's what we are going to talk about tomorrow. We have Alexandra Jeschke joining us, and an artist, ecologist, Oliver Kellhammer. And I'm also very delighted that two others are going to join us, Adam and Mendel, from a podcast that is called Future Ecologies, who are both practitioners, but also thinkers about ecology. So it's going to be really interesting. And I hope you all join us tomorrow at 10, same time, same link. So everyone that has the Zoom link, join us for that conversation. It's going to be really interesting.
Thanks, Victoria. I think we should wrap up now. We have to have some constraints. I mean, this has actually been a kind of indication in many ways that we didn't know what would happen when we set this out, but as a platform where we're getting people from all over the world, I think it's really fantastic. I know there's some people in Iran. I know there's some people, I mean, all of China, all over the place. And I think that hopefully we can build upon this and explore this. I mean, I feel like we're almost in outer space in some senses. This is a new terrain. We're trying to find out what you can do. And, you know, I think that the point is ultimately it's not really about the digital at all. It's about the digital as a platform, but it's enabling us to kind of communicate in a very kind of social way, and I think that's a very special operation. I just want to thank our special guests today. I mean, it's Brian and Barbara, wonderful contributions, and really, actually, the best way to start off. I mean, just the very abstract concepts about membranes. It opens up a whole huge kind of the floodgates of the imagination. Again, you triggered a lot of things. It was amazing as a discussion. I also want to thank Sanford for his, wonderful comments and interventions. I always love this kind kind of thing. And then also Victoria and Marina for your contributions. To be continued. That's what I can say. Is we have a series of other sessions. I think that tomorrow will be very interesting because Alexandra is she doesn't describe herself as a theorist, but actually I think she is precisely what we need in theorists as a theorist, not someone with a label. There's a kind of static label, but rather someone who is proactively and continually questioning and thinking and so on. To my mind, we should maybe get rid of the word theory and just think about how to use the word, some kind of actative word like thinking or questioning or something. So I'm looking forward to that a lot. And please, if Barbara and Brian, if you're free to the rest of the week, please come and join us. I know that Lev Manovich is going to be parachuting in from Korea at some point as well. So thank you everyone for this, and thanks. I want to also mention, because there are a few people from the team outside who are part of this today. Gustavo is here today, and there's a whole group behind this is working incredibly hard putting this together. We also talking about membranes. We have a discussion about inclusivity, discussion about that, which is starting tomorrow as well. So thank you everyone behind the scenes who is kind of putting this together. Thank you for the team and for the guests today. It's been a really interesting, provocative discussion to be continued. And I hope that we'll get more engagement from our colleagues from outside. And thank you for the contributions from Samina and others today. So mulțumesc. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.